Because of the beasts on the way, I thought it would be fun to pander to my audience and talk about some beasts. That, and finally getting toys of all 5 original Maximals last year was probably my proudest achievement as a collector thus far, and I think it's past time for me to finally talk about them. So today, I'm going to start that process with a review of Kingdom Deluxe Cheetor. This figure has probably the most lifelike Cheetah Mode of any Cheetor toy thus far. The original toy is obviously way off the mark, with its chunky proportions and massive flat hind feet. The Universe version tried to be a more realistic looking cheetah, but ended up kind of overcorrecting in my opinion, leaning so far into the long and lanky that it almost looked like a caricature. But putting this Cheetor next to an image of a real-life cheetah, he's almost spot on. All of the proportions look correct, and most of the shapes are preserved very nicely. The only inaccuracies I can see with the design are the waist being a bit too thick and the shoulder hump being a little small. Other than that, he looks almost perfect. Well, if you ignore all the transformation elements, that is. Cheetor is actually pretty good at hiding his robot parts, but there are still a couple pieces visible. The robot shins are visible on the backs of his hind legs, and you can see the robot hands if you look from the bottom. But even aside from those, there are still a lot of compromises for the sake of the conversion. There's a pair of hinges visible on the cheetah's back, as well as some indentations to give clearance. Also, there are some very small gaps through his abdomen where the parts don't come together completely. And probably most visibly, the robot thighs bulge out from the sides, and the front legs kinda just float there. That said, these flaws are only really visible when you're looking for them. When you're just looking at him, you probably won't notice anything wrong, especially with how well hidden everything else is. It helps that the figure is so well detailed. Obviously, the figure is covered almost entirely in spots of varying size and shape, just like a real cheetah. There are some areas that look a little barren, but they're few and far between. Plus, they're relatively small, and probably would have been hard to hit with a paint mask anyway, so I can understand why they were omitted. In addition to the spots, he also has a large swath of cream-colored paint across his chin, throat, and belly. Again, just like a real cheetah. Not only that, but the figure is covered head to toe in sculpted fur detail, and even that is trying to be as close as possible to a real cheetah. Most of the fur is rough and stubbly, but the underbelly is much smoother, mimicking the fur textures of real cheetahs. I love this real-world accurate approach to the Kingdom toys. And all of this carries over into the cheetah's head. Not only are all of the spots painted on, but the tear tracks and brow lines are painted in as well. The fur detail is a bit subdued here, but even then there are tufts of it on his ears. The eyes are done in orange, which is not accurate to any version of his original toy, or the eyes of the Cheetah Mode in the cartoon, but this is more for the sake of the robot mode. Plus, this makes him more real-world accurate since cheetah eyes are actually an orange color. Strangely enough though, no pupils. Still, the shape of the sockets makes them very expressive depending on the viewing angle. Teeth are unpainted though, which is a bit unfortunate. Articulation-wise, the cheetah shoulders are on swivels and ball joints, allowing universal motion. The elbows bend 45 degrees, and the paws are on ball joints. Going around to the back, the hips can kick backward and rotate out to the sides, the knees can bend, and the paws are, once again, on ball joints. Nothing in the neck, waist, or tail, but the jaw is on a hinge, so you can make him talk or bite. The cheetah is 6.5 inches long nose to tail, and 3 inches tall at the shoulder. For reference, that's about the same size as the original Wolfang toy, which is actually kind of impressive considering the shrinkflation Transformers have seen over the years. Of course, Cheetor is noticeably lighter in weight than Wolfang, and has a lot less meat on his bones, so you can definitely still tell where the budget cuts went. But considering that his thinner build actually makes him more real-world accurate, I can see this being a bit of a positive to some. Overall, I'd say this is a really good Cheetah Mode. It could be better, but compared to past figures, this is a big improvement. Cheetor toys tend to transform rather simply, and I wouldn't call this figure an exception. The only real trick to it is the fact that the hind legs fold up to form the robot shins. After that, it's standard fare. Open up the torso to reveal the arms, bring the cheetah head down to form the chest, let the front legs hang off the back. I like how they use the cheetah mouth as a connection point, and I'm glad that the cheetah flanks can fold back in to fill out the torso, but that aside, there really isn't too much to the transformation. And you know what? I'm fine with that. Oh, and by the way, if the tab on the back of the cheetah head breaks off, don't worry about it. It serves no purpose other than to get in the way, everything stays in place just fine without it. The big reason I'm okay with the bare bones transformation is how surprisingly effective it is. I cannot believe how they managed to go from a realistic cheetah to a highly screen-accurate Cheetor robot in less than 20 steps. Once again, almost every detail from the animation model is carried over into the robot. Even little things like the ridges on his arms and the gears behind his shoulders. Admittedly, the Roger Rabbit effect here is not quite as strong as it was with Black Arachnia, but it's only because of little deviations like the cheetah paw kneecaps and the realistic cheetah head chest. Oh, and the color scheme. Yeah, compared to the cartoon model, this Cheetor has a much brighter yellow and a much paler blue. I don't think the yellow is much of an issue, since it's really not that different from past Cheetor toys, but the baby blue instead of cobalt is much harder to excuse. That said, I will admit that the colors have grown on me since the figure was revealed. It's still recognizably Cheetor after all. Even if he is miscolored, you wouldn't confuse him for a different character. And if the color tones bother you, there's always the Walmart exclusive Netflix release, if you don't mind paying extra for a figure with unpainted legs. At least the head sculpt is definitely Cheetor. The cartoon model took some liberties from the original toy's head design, and the Universe toy was just... why? Kingdom Cheetor's head, however, is almost exactly like the cartoon's head, only beaten out by the masterpiece. The only details I think are missing are details that probably would have been too small anyway, like the feline philtrum and the faux freckles on his cheeks. Everything else is adapted faithfully, even the lines on his cheek guards, which are barely visible in the cartoon. Articulation-wise, the neck is on a ball joint, but the shape of the helmet limits the motion a little. The shoulders are on universal swivels with forward butterfly hinges. He also has a bicep swivel, 90-degree elbows, and a wrist swivel. He has a waist swivel and universal hips, though the shape of the parts prevents the legs from moving backwards that much. The front skirt does lift up for forward kicks, though. Swivel above the knee, just under 90 degrees of knee bend, and ankles that tilt forward and back as well as side to side. His feet are a little small, though, so some poses might take some extra work to get him balanced, though usually a slight adjustment to his hips does it. In this body, Cheetor wielded a pair of handheld blasters formed from the cheetah's tail and, more famously, guts. This toy includes neither of those weapons. Instead, his tail detaches to form a bladed whip like his Transmetal toy. The end of the tail is 5mm in diameter, so he can hold it in either hand, which is actually really cool considering how natural it manages to look. It's just odd that they gave him this weapon instead of either of his classic weapons. The gut gun's omission is somewhat understandable, since that space is taken up by the arms, but I don't see why they couldn't have given us the tail gun in some form. Plus, the friction between the fist and the tail can cause the painted stripes to start rubbing off. It's not the end of the world, but it's not something I can really excuse either. To the tip of his head crest, Cheetor stands at almost exactly 5 inches tall. Once again, this puts him around the same height as Wolfang, but much thinner, at least in the torso. Still, judging by pictures and videos, Wolfang was already a little bigger than the original Cheetor toy, so at least in terms of physical size, I don't feel like much is lost here. I really like Kingdom Cheetor. The fact that he can go from a realistic cheetah to a cartoon-accurate robot at a retail price point is astounding, and the level of articulation in both modes makes him fun to mess around with and pose. But at the same time, I can't brush aside his shortcomings. While I like the bright yellow and baby blue, I won't deny that it detracts from the screen-accurate aesthetic, and the omission of his classic weapons is inexcusable. Still, I think this toy's positives greatly outweigh the negatives. Now, finding this toy for retail price 2 years after its original release may be difficult, but if you can manage it, I would give him a soft recommendation, especially if you're just looking to fill a hole in your collection.